I am so pleased to welcome everyone to tonight's event, a conversation with Colonel Yevgeny Eugene Vindman. My name is Bob Earlwine. I am the director, the new director of Eastern Michigan University's Center for Jewish Studies. Tonight's event, which the center is bringing to you, is co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the Department of Political Science, the Department of History and Philosophy, and Hillel at EMU. I would like to thank members of the board of the Center for Jewish Studies for all of the insight they bring to the center and all of the hard work they do on its behalf. I would also like to thank the foundation, whose fundraising efforts on the center's behalf make this sort of programming possible. We are a young program, and it is the contribution of members of the community that make what we do possible. Tonight, it is our great pleasure to welcome Colonel Vindman. And given the prominence of Ukraine in Colonel Vindman's work and tonight's discussion, I also wanted to briefly mention that Jewish Family Services is currently reaching out to people who are sponsoring friends or family from Ukraine through the Uniting for Ukraine program. And you can go to their website at jfsannarbor.org for more information about how you can help. Now, before we begin with tonight's talk, I want to say a few words about some upcoming events. On February 13th, Professor Mara Benjamin of Mount Holyoke College will give a talk titled Becoming Earthbound, Jewish Thought in an Age of Climate Change for us. And Dr. Benjamin's most recent book, The Obligated Self, was the recipient of the 2019 American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence and was a finalist for the 2018 National Jewish Book Award in the Women's Studies category. And then on March 13th, we're excited to bring Professor Michal Raucher from Rutgers University, and she will give a talk titled Jews for Choice, How Jews Are Advocating for Abortion Rights. As with all of the events the Center of Jewish Studies presents, these talks are not only open to the public, but they are public-facing. That is, they are not primarily academic talks, but rather are intended to be accessible and engaging for a broad audience. And, like tonight's event, these will be hybrid so that you can attend either in person or on Zoom. I'm going to have my colleague, Professor Jeff Bernstein, introduce and engage our distinguished speaker, Colonel Eugene Vindman, tonight. Professor Bernstein is a much beloved figure at EMU, a professor of political science, a celebrated, indeed award-winning teacher, and the author of numerous and distinguished publications, particularly in the area of teaching and learning scholarship in political science. Professor Bernstein is the director of the Bruce K. Nelson Faculty Development Center at Eastern Michigan University, and he's also on the board of the Center for Jewish Studies. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Bernstein.
Thank you. So I am pleased tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, a fellow Brooklyn boy. Yevgeny Vindman is a former colonel in the U.S. Army, retired. He previously served as the deputy legal advisor on the White House National Security Council, where his portfolio included NATO, the International Criminal Court, African Affairs, international organizations, emerging technologies, international humanitarian law, human rights, and ethics. Prior to the National Security Council, he served in a variety of roles in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General Corps, including Senior Policy Attorney Advisor for the Labor and Employment Division at the Pentagon, Senior Prosecutor for Fort Hood, and as an Operational Law Attorney for U.S. Forces Iraq. He served for 12 years as an infantry officer, including an assignment as an airborne infantry platoon leader in the 82nd Airborne Division. Vindman came to national attention in October of 2019 when his twin brother, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, testified before the United States Congress regarding the Trump-Ukraine scandal. Yevgeny received the report of President Trump's perfect phone call from Alex and reported the call to senior White House lawyers. Alex's testimony provided evidence that resulted in a charge of abuse of power in the impeachment of Donald Trump and immortality in the former president's Twitter feed. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Yevgeny Vindman, who
So thank you all first for coming here. And if you notice the sign here says capacity of 250. Anytime I draw more than 10%, I consider that a success. So thank you for coming. Alex also recently got into a Twitter battle with Elon Musk. So he likes to brag that he's gotten into an argument or probably argument with the most powerful man and the richest man on the planet. So first, I'm going to talk about really three topics. One is how I got to be here. So a little bit about my upbringing, my 25-year military career. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ukrainian war, the Russian war on Ukraine. And also then I'm going to talk about my work working with an international body to help the Ukrainians investigate and prosecute war crimes. So my family emigrated from the Soviet Union in December of 1979. My dad brought my twin brother and I, my older brother and his mother-in-law to the United States. As they say, he was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, but he became very disillusioned with the party and life in the Soviet Union with anti-Semitism. And at the time, my mother was ill, terminally ill, turns out, with cancer. She ended up dying before we left the Soviet Union, but he hoped that she could be treated in the States. When we got to the United States, my dad did not speak any English, and kind of a classic immigration tale. He hauled furniture for $20 a day until he learned enough English to pass a pretty technical engineering exam in New York City, and he worked for the rest of his life or career. He's still alive. He just turned 90 this summer, so he's still kicking. As a sand hog, building the water tunnels underneath the city. And when we came over, and I speak loudly, but if you can't hear me, I can come closer to the mic or just project. So on the upper left, that picture is a still from a Ken Burns documentary. We'd like to say that we discovered Ken Burns in the early 80s. We happened to be a couple of, I guess, fairly wild but maybe cute immigrant kids on the Brighton Beach boardwalk. And he was, this is one of his earlier works where on the Statue of Liberty. And so he briefly, this is maybe 7-second clip, he asked us what we thought or where we came from. And we, as twins do, we talked over each other and finished each other's sentences and talked about our sort of brief immigration story. In the middle is our grandmother. You'll see she's smoking a cigarette. She's a great lady, great grandmother. She ended up dying from brain, stomach, and lung cancer because she smoked for 51 years. So don't smoke, kids. But there's another picture to the right. That's Alex and I not long after we arrived. I'll let you try to figure out who's who in that picture. Down below in black and white, that's us in Caesars Bay in Brooklyn. We grew up in Brooklyn, we're products of New York City public schools and proud of that, and that's the Verrazano Bridge. And we're standing right near Caesars Bay, which interestingly enough for history buffs is where the British landed in the Battle of Brooklyn and where they outflanked Washington, almost ended the Revolutionary War, but that's a different story. Upper right, that's Alex and I with our daughters. We're holding each other's daughters. Mine is the redhead. They're bigger now. And to the left, middle of the screen, that's Alex and I walking out of his testimony before Congress. And that was an interesting experience, certainly. But the most interesting thing there is that, first of all, he did a magnificent job. He stood up for himself, and he represented Army values, and frankly, he did his duty. I got to sit behind him and support him, and we both worked at the White House. And the next day, he didn't want to come to work because he anticipated there would be a bit of a firestorm. But I said, no, let's go in. Let's go into the White House. First thing we did was we went to where the cameras are, and we had a nice cup of coffee to make sure that everybody knew that we're back at work and we're going to do what we need to do for the American people. And then we also high-fived each other in the hallways, talking about how great a job he did. Because during that period, between the time he was, between his testimony and the impeachment and the trial, it was basically like we were in an enemy camp. So lots of dirty look, lots of whispering, some comments, and but we had a job to do, and we intended to do it. Bottom right, that's Alex at the Pentagon with me during my promotion to lieutenant colonel. And to the left, we're kind of a military family. That's my wife, Cindy. She is a Army microbiologist, molecular geneticist by training, and she's in the Medical Service Corps. So, all right. This is a map of Ukraine, and many of you are already aware of this, but the Russians at the outset of the campaign had a number of strategic objectives, and if you look at this list, the only one that they've managed to achieve is control of the Black Sea and Azov seaports and land bridge to Russia. And frankly, in my opinion, and the opinion of most people that are knowledgeable in this area, that's temporary, because they're going to end up losing this war. The Russians attacked on 3 axes across a massive front with, frankly, a force insufficient to achieve their objectives. They anticipated that the Ukrainians would fold, that the West and NATO, the U.S., would not come together coherently and stand up to the Russians, and that they would be greeted as liberators, and that they were frankly wrong on all 3 of those. And when you start a campaign like this with false or incorrect strategic assumptions, the operational and tactical objectives become almost impossible to achieve. So this is actually a little bit out of date, but you can see that since the outset of the war, the Ukrainians liberated basically the entire north, and even in that a bit of the red area, right on the border of where you see the blue arrows and the red arrows, a good chunk of that territory, another 1,000 square miles, has been liberated, and that's the entire Donetsk Oblast. The trip before last, and I've had 4 trips to Ukraine. I went out to that area about 70 kilometers from the fighting, and got to see some of the destruction firsthand, and I'll show you some pictures that represent some of what's going on there. Also in the south, you can't see it so much, but the Ukrainians have recently pushed Russian forces across the major water obstacle. It's the Dnieper River out of Kherson. So they're really on the back foot now, and there's no foreseeable mechanism for them to be able to turn the momentum back and win this ground war. And if we get into the topic of WMDs, I'm glad to talk about that, but I don't see that as a likely outcome. So, this is not coming out exactly like it should. All right, but in any case, I think you can see most of what you need to see. So if you look on the right side of the screen, you can see approximately the forces that the Russians brought to bear at the outset of the campaign. They had about 150,000, 45,000 military, actually frontline fighting troops, and then 100,000 support forces, and that's typical of a campaign like that. Most of a good chunk of the forces that are in a campaign are support forces, and much fewer are either armor or infantry forces. If you look on the left side, you can see that these are the casualties as of November 26th. So if they brought 45,000 troops to the fight at the outset, they've lost 86,000 so far on the Russian side. They've lost, and these are Ukrainian numbers. I think Western numbers are generally in line with this. Within certainly an order of magnitude, but they've lost about 3,000 tanks, almost 6,000 armored vehicles. Their equipment and their forces have been decimated, and they've been forced to mobilize 300,000 additional troops. But these are green troops. They're poorly trained. The training is not likely to improve over the course of the next months because they lack the small unit leadership necessary to appropriately train. And as a major land army, they're basically ceased to exist as a major land army. The way the campaign is likely, well, we'll talk about this in a second. So what I anticipate in phase 4, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through what the different phases. I showed you phase 1, which is the initial attack. There was a stalemate briefly. That was kind of phase 2. The return of Ukrainian momentum and taking back the territory was phase 3. Phase 4 is what we're likely to see over the course of the coming months, the winter. The Ukrainians are on the offensive, and frankly, it's about sustaining their capabilities. So right now, there are no foreign militaries in Ukraine. There's a foreign legion with volunteers, which is basically people from foreign countries that have raised their hand and volunteered to fight for Ukraine. But there is no foreign military. The Ukrainians have borne the brunt of the fighting largely on their own. What's enabled the fighting and their ability to sustain the combat is a huge influx of Western equipment, materiel, ammunition, but not everything that they need. For instance, they don't have long-range artillery, long-range rocket systems. They don't have any aviation. If you could imagine, if the Ukrainians were fully equipped as a modern military, a modern Western military, this fight likely would have been over much longer. By piecemeal feeding in the forces or the materiel that they're receiving, we're prolonging the fight. And if I was a cynic, I would say, well, that's bleeding sort of the Russian forces more, so they sustain more casualties. But it's also very problematic and injurious to the Ukrainian people. As we can see, since October, there's been an infrastructure campaign, and I can talk a little bit more about that. Okay. I'm not going to read each one. So I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the law and a couple of the issues that come up. So the start of the conflict. The UN is an international body that was designed in the wake of World War II to basically prevent aggressive wars. There was a precursor to this organization called the League of Nations, and that failed before World War II because the countries that were part of the League of Nations did not stand up for Ethiopia. Actually, was the principal example. Ethiopia was attacked by the Italians in 1937. The attacks were horrific, using chemical weapons and indiscriminate bombing. The emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, went to the League of Nations, pled to the international community for them to step in, and the international community failed. And 2 years later, you had World War II. And so I'm not going to, I don't know that we're necessarily in an analogous situation, although I can easily build a scenario with the Chinese, for instance, in Taiwan, where there is a similar outcome. Right now, that does not look likely because the international community has to a significant degree come together, sanctioned the Russians, and provided material support. But the war is not over. And if the Russians manage to win, or manage to eke out a win, other aggressive powers are going to take that lesson. And I think the world will become a much more dangerous place. So just ad bellum, I try to keep the Latin here to a minimum, but it's justice at the start of war, basically, and jus in bello is justice, just war in the fighting of war. And so the Russians are basically, the start of their war was illegal, and the way they're fighting the war is illegal. The four principles of the law of armed conflict, or international criminal law, are principles of military necessity, distinction, proportionality, and humanity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's basically how you fight a war legally. A war, by its very nature, is brutal and destructive, but there are certain rules put in place through the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, on how to minimize the damage and injury to civilians, civilian personnel and objects. And so the way the Russians are actually fighting this war is illegal as well as a start. Talk briefly about siege, and I already talked about the UN Charter. So one of the major issues with this war is that the Russians have violated a core principle of the UN, and as a veto member, a P5 member of the UN, they're actually charged in the Security Council with defending a rules-based international order, and they violated that order. And so one of the questions that's recently come up, and it's interesting, is, well, Russia, why are they on the UN in the first place? That seat was originally held by the Soviet Union, and Russia took it by virtue of becoming sort of accepted as a successor state. But it could have been a different state. It could have been Ukraine, for instance. And so, and how that was done, just an interesting legal question. So my work now focuses on an international program called the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. And I just mentioned how the UN has failed in this regard. And so this Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group was announced by the U.S. Secretary of State in May. The European Union Foreign Minister and the United Kingdom Foreign Minister, as an international program, sort of to step into the place of the UN and help with the investigation and prosecution of war crimes. And so our job, our international mission, is to work with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General to investigate and prosecute war crimes. And that includes things like attacks on civilians and civilian objects, the massive deportations, including deportations of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia. Interestingly enough, the Russian minister for Children's Affairs adopted Ukrainian children from the East, or a Ukrainian child. You know, that's kidnapping in any other place. So, and that's a war crime. And then I am the director of a group called the Interagency Working Group. It's a Ukrainian body of military personnel, prosecutors, investigators, security services, that investigate basically every strike. And as of last week, I think they had 48,000 or 49,000 open cases. So it's a monumental task. The Ukrainians are actually pretty impressive in a number of their capabilities, but a scope of something like this, 49,000 cases, is gargantuan. And it's going to take the international community, it's going to take other countries exercising potentially universal jurisdiction for war crimes, because every country, as a matter of their domestic law, per the Geneva Conventions, has to have laws on the books that prohibit war crimes or violations of the Geneva Conventions. And so our job is to help train them, help them manage and provide resources, and also provide specialists on the area of international law. So specifically on the law of war. If you think about the law of war, I mean, the Ukrainians have plenty of experienced prosecutors, murder, sexual violence, but what they don't have is plenty of experienced war crimes prosecutors, because they have not had that experience. And so our international commission has, for instance, Croatian prosecutors, war crimes prosecutors, Serbians, folks that have had a recent experience in this area of the law. Lex specialis means that it's a special area of the law that has specific rules on what a violation or a war crime is. All right, so this is kind of an eye chart, but in red is what the interagency working group. It's led by a Ukrainian 3-star, but these are all the different sort of governmental organizations that feed into this interagency working group and who they work with. And so it's a very complex task even to coordinate an investigation. And this is not just a uniquely Ukrainian issue. If this were to happen in the US, it would be probably as complex, so we have probably even more law enforcement agencies and other bodies that could be involved. So, all right. And I think this is my last slide, and I'm sticking to the schedule generally, but just a brief sampling of the types of war crimes that we see. So, as I mentioned before, I was out in the Kharkiv Oblast, and there is Kharkiv is the second largest city in the in Ukraine. And it has a population, I think, it had a population north of 1 million, maybe even 2 million. And it's built in these sort of massive Soviet-style apartment blocks. And you can see a little bit on the upper left there. And there's a neighborhood closest to the Russian border, because Kharkiv is actually within 20 or 30 kilometers of the Russian border, that housed about 100,000 people. It's a massive sort of like apartment complex. And this area was shelled repeatedly, bombed by aviation, and there's not a soul there left. Not everybody was killed, certainly not the vast majority of people were killed, although lots of people were killed there. But 100,000 people were displaced, had to look for a different place to live. Their lives completely disrupted, all their possessions destroyed, and it was a ghost town. And oddly enough, there was a street sweeper there, and so you have these almost completely destroyed buildings, and you have somebody sweeping up the glass and such, and not just the individual. So attempt to return to normalcy, but it's going to take some time. The other thing is that the Russians have attacked what are called civilian objects in violation of the principle of distinction. So you can only attack military targets that give you a distinct military advantage. And you cannot attack civilian personnel or civilian objects. And there is a specific list of objects like hospitals, maternity wards, schools, cemeteries that you're not allowed to attack. unless, and this is an exception, just like there is an exception to just about any legal rule, unless it's being used by the opposing military. But the Russians have repeatedly attacked schools, civilian infrastructure, maternity wards, where there were no Ukrainian military forces around, in violation of the principle of distinction. I think that's probably all I'm going to say about the slides, and I want to leave sufficient time to have a conversation and questions.
So, I want to start off with the phone call. So your brother was on the phone call with, listening in on Donald Trump talking to Zelensky from Ukraine, and Zelensky's asking Trump for an increase in military aid, and Trump says, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." I imagine that your brother immediately sensed something's up with this, and this is not the way it ought to be. How did he react, and how did you suddenly get drawn into this service?
Sure. So Alex and I worked across the hall from each other on the National Security Council, and how we ended up there is interesting in and of itself. Alex had been a foreign area officer, so he spent time in Ukraine. He spent 3 years in Moscow in the embassy, and he spent 3 years on the Joint Staff. So he was kind of like groomed for this. For me, about 3 weeks before I was supposed to go to a different job, I got a phone call saying, "Hey, we got a deal for you." And I thought, okay, well, this is either Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that. It turned out to be the Trump White House. So anyway, he started about a week before me, and before the phone call, we'd been on the staff for actually about a year and change, actually, by the time the phone call occurred. And the events that brought this about were President Zelensky was elected in the spring of that year, and he had a reputation as a reformer. Lots of hopes were being pinned on him, and the Ukrainians will be the first ones to tell you that the war started in 2014, not 2022. This is just a new, more aggressive phase. And so Alex, as the country director, had drafted the letter congratulating President Zelensky. I reviewed it, and it was signed by the president. Then there were parliamentary elections, which were a landslide. And so that means basically Zelensky ended up having Democratic carte blanche. And a phone call was proposed after the presidential election, but the president declined. And we weren't sure exactly why. And this was clearly Alex's portfolio, but I certainly took an interest in this because it was a major national security issue. We both recognized that, and that's how we treated it. And before this phone call that occurred on July 25th, at the parliamentary elections, by the time the president called, most of the world leaders had already called Zelensky. Usually a phone call is done within a day or two. I think it took 3 or 4 days for him to call. We'd heard grumblings from within the White House that there was some side deal that was going on. And Alex actually got a hint of that in July, on July 10th, so about 3 weeks before the call. He was in another West Wing meeting where something along the lines of what the president was talking about was raised with the National Security Advisor for the Ukrainians that was visiting. And Alex actually reported that to John Eisenberg, who was my boss. He was a senior lawyer. He was a deputy White House counsel. And John Eisenberg didn't do anything. He sat on that information, and frankly, if I were to pin the impeachment and the president's actions on anybody's failure to act, I would say it was John Eisenberg, because he had an opportunity to raise it with the president, who he saw several times a week. Anyway, Alex and I discussed whether the phone call should take place, because we thought that this young new president needed to be bolstered. The U.S. needed to support this democracy against Russian attack. And we thought, hey, what's the worst that can happen? So
famous last words.
Yes. So he listened to the phone call, and it was fairly early in the morning. It was about 9:30, and I was back in my office, and he comes in and he closes the door, and I could tell there's something wrong because I've known the guy for 48 years, and we just had our 47th birthday in June. And so he tells me, the president just basically asked, was extorting President Zelensky, and he gave me just a brief rundown. I think he was still processing it. We briefly discussed it, and I had the role of the ethics attorney on the NSC staff at the time. And I said, okay, we didn't discuss it. We had like silent communication, partially, but we knew that we had a duty as Army officers, as civil servants, to report it. We thought that a criminal act had occurred, and to the extent that anybody can backpedal and say, oh no, this is like a misunderstanding. The president likes to talk in very broad generalities. We knew we had an obligation to report it, and so we reported it to John Eisenberg once again, and Michael Ellis, and that was that for the day. I raised this topic 2 more times to make sure that something was going to happen, because it was my obligation. I had a professional responsibility obligation as well as a lawyer. We even sat in Eisenberg's office where we talked about what laws the president might have violated, and we're Googling them. So that's how we left it until the whistleblower came out, and the report became public.
So now when you go forward to your supervisor and are basically reporting that the president has engaged in unethical and illegal conduct, and you're sitting there talking about what laws he might have broken, did you get a sense at that moment, did you feel a sense what firestorm was going to be hitting and how famous you were going to be and how this would lead you one day to Ypsilanti, Michigan to talk about these things?
I never imagined I'd be in Ypsilanti, Michigan. But
Same here.
And it's great to be here, actually.
Same here.
But no, I understood the gravity. I think we both understood the gravity of what he had heard, what we had discussed, and of reporting it. Could we imagine, the attacks, the vilification, hatred from probably 25 to 30% of the country? The threats and hate mail? Probably no. We didn't envision that detail, but we knew that this would be problematic. But frankly, we both at the time spent 25. I retired after 25 years this year, so it would have been about 22 years, and Alex is about the same at the time in the military, and we were frankly not easily intimidated. My dad, when it became public, and he was of course very surprised and very nervous because he came from the Soviet system, and had this happened in the Soviet Union, I think we would have been in much greater physical jeopardy. But we had confidence in the system. We had confidence in the military. Some of that partially misplaced, but we knew that we would survive it. We didn't know exactly how things would play out.
Now, you mentioned earlier that to Ukrainians this war started in 2014, and that the recent escalation of hostilities is just an escalation of what's been going on. Can you connect the dots to from that phone call and from what came from Ukraine to where we are today? How do you make that? How do you kind of connect those dots?
Yeah. So we reported the phone call as a jeopardy to national security, because we understood that Ukraine has obviously been borne out this year, was at the tip of the spear, a democracy fighting against a dictatorship. And so we understood that the stakes were high, and that got lost. It became politicized. It became a Republican Democrat versus a kind of moral, ethical question, or legal question for that matter. And we, when the impeachment occurred and there was a failure of accountability, the Russians observed that. The Russians also observed, frankly, the January 6th riots, and they thought that the U.S. was weak and in decline. They thought that NATO was fractured. They misapprehended what I agree was a disastrous pullout from Afghanistan. And I'm talking about how it was executed, not the policy of whether it should have happened or not. I think the execution was problematic. And so they took all these lessons, and they thought, in the balance of power where they were militarily, or they thought they were, or Putin thought he was militarily, with the Ukrainians, the U.S. in its position, the West. That's how we ended up with this major war in Europe, and frankly, the biggest challenge to a rules-based international order since World War II.
Thank you. So your father and your family left Ukraine out of a real fear of rising anti-Semitism and what was going on there. And in the last 5 years here, we've seen Nazis marching through Charlottesville. Just this week, our president shared a meal at Mar-a-Lago with a noted Holocaust denier and white supremacist. Tell me the extent to which you worry about growing anti-Semitism in the United States, and to what extent maybe where you come from originally colors in one way or another what you're seeing today?
So, I grew up in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is a multicultural melting pot, and so frankly, I didn't think much about anti-Semitism in Brooklyn. And even in the military, although there were some hints and some incidents, generally speaking, anti-Semitism was not a problem. And for the most part, I didn't think that much about anti-Semitism or racism or the massive rise in hate over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. And it's a major problem. It's actually a recognized national security problem in the latest national security strategy. This administration has considered homegrown or domestic terrorism and extremism as a national security threat. And I think actually on the ride over with Bob, we had this very good discussion, and I didn't understand what is where does anti-Semitism come from, really? It's odd, because, I think the Jewish people are very well integrated in American society, and I think perhaps it has something to do with the very fact that most Jews look like every other ordinary American. And so to the extent that having this cabal of what look like ordinary Americans claiming that there's some sort of desire to control or recreate a world order is an attack, or the purpose is to damage democracy. So I think that may be something to it. Now I'm going to have to read that paper that you mentioned.
Thank you. Maybe one more question, and then we can start taking from the audience. So, and along those lines of sort of, Jews being very much integrated into the United States, I mean, some of the most prominent families in this country have Jewish members of it: the Clintons, the Kennedys, the Trumps. And how do we square the fact that the former president has a son-in-law who is quite Jewishly active and committed, a daughter who has converted to Judaism, children being raised as Orthodox Jews, with some of the interesting behaviors around these issues? How do we square that circle? How do we assess Donald Trump in this context?
So, generally speaking, I think it's an attack on democracy, attack on civil structures, which destabilizes things in such a way as to allow him to gain power. For Donald Trump, I think it's all about power. He's anti-Semitic to the extent that he doesn't care one way or another about Jews, including the status of his own family. All he cares about is power, and he's willing to use any mechanism, including white supremacists, nationalists, in order to retain that power. And his son-in-law and daughter are quite Jewish. I went to Jewish services in the White House, and Jared Kushner actually read the whole Megillah. And like the saying goes, it's quite long, and he did the whole thing, and in Hebrew, and frankly, I was impressed. So that, he's a practicing Orthodox Jew, I think. So is Ivanka and their family. But it's about destroying democratic structures and faith and confidence in democracy by saying that there's some sort of like cabal of people that look a lot like you, but they're not like you. They're trying to do, and about retaining power.
Thank you. Bob, do we want to take some questions from the audience here? Or
Is that a wireless mic?
Yeah.
it is wireless?
Oh, okay, maybe we'll just...
Okay.
Are there any... Okay.
I can just stand and project. Hi, thank you for being here. How common is it for two brothers to serve in the White House? And was this coincidence? And if so, it seems like a really amazing coincidence. How did that happen?
Well, Alex and I have found ourselves in some pickles in the past, and some odd scenarios. I mean, discovering Ken Burns is one of them, but there are others. I am not a strong believer in luck. I think that you end up in situations where your actions have led you in a certain pattern, and in a professional sense, doing the work, establishing yourself, and demonstrating you're capable provides opportunities for other things to happen. And so we ended up at the White House in some ways by happenstance, but mostly because we had done things that demonstrated that we were capable of working at the White House at the highest level of U.S. government. And how common is that? I think there was, we heard rumors that there were other twins, not necessarily directors in the NSC, and one part of a twin set. So there were a couple of twins like, oh, I have a twin, but they don't work at the NSC. At the time we were there, I think we were the only twins. But I will say it was critical because I think without having each other there, when we were kind of under assault, it was very difficult. And I think if either one of us was there, and I can't imagine that another Army officer would have taken Alex's report and done something different. But maybe somebody could have taken the report and said, okay, you know what, I think you should sit on this, or I think you should, let's mull it over, let's come back to me next week, and it would have been subsumed by some other NSC business. And 35 years from now, the record's declassified, people would have read about it, and after Donald Trump's second term. But
thank you so much for coming. This is fabulously enlightening. The question I'm going to ask, and I could be wrong about what I'm asking, and if I'm wrong, correct me, and I will sit here silently and be perfectly happy. It seems to me, from what I've been reading, that the relationship between Ukraine and Israel is somewhat vexed, in terms of one being reluctant to support the other at any given time. I was wondering if you could enlighten us a little bit as to why that is.
So first of all, Marty, thanks for inviting me. Your random, I think, DM or something like that was what got us rolling here. So, and I'm game for just about anything. So you know, the relationship between Israel and Ukraine is interesting. I mean, there are not many countries in the world that are led by Jews. Right? So Ukraine is one, Israel is another. I would have to think long and hard if I can think of a third one. But so there, and frankly, a large chunk of the population in Israel are ex-Soviet Jews. A great number of them from Ukraine. Ukraine also, as a former Soviet republic, enjoys the second largest population of Jews that are currently living there. Russia is the largest, and so I think the Israelis are in a spot. Now, I say that because I think they're wrong. I think they should be doing more. I think, but they're in a spot because they understand that there's a large Jewish population in Russia, and so they don't want to stir a pot that can cause blowback on that population. They also have Russian forces in Syria, just north of them. So I think it is a bit of a difficult situation. And frankly, I remember 3 or 4 months ago, I tweeted something, and a member of the Israeli government contacted me, said, "Hey, I just want to set the record straight that this is actually what happened, not like what I wrote." So they're very savvy about how they communicate, but they're not doing enough, because ultimately this is a fight. Democracies are trying to maintain a rules-based order and stop the advance of dictatorships. Israel is a democracy. If a flawed democracy, it's certainly still a democracy, and they're in a position where they can do some things, and they're doing some things already, more than they did at the start of the war, but not enough.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask, let's suppose that this war comes to an end at some point, and it comes to an end with Russia forced to negotiate. Is there any way under international law that they can be made to pay for the billions of dollars of damage that they've inflicted on the Ukraine? So one way might be to say to them, for every barrel of oil that you ship out of the country, you get 75 cents on the dollar, and the Ukraine gets 25 cents until your debt is paid off.
Yeah, so there are a number of different thoughts about this topic, and some of them with Russian agreement, some of them without Russian agreement. And the easiest way to solve an issue like this is if they come to the negotiating table and they themselves agree to pay some reparations. That's that's not atypical for when a country loses a war. Iraq was forced to pay reparations to Kuwait after the first Gulf War. There are also thoughts about how to do this, and by just national governments, and that topic has actually come up in U.S. Congress, and it's a little bit of a fraught topic because the U.S. is kind of the reserve currency for the world, and so different parts of the U.S. government have different equities, and so the Department of the Treasury is always saying, "Oh, we shouldn't sanction, or we shouldn't take action that can damage the U.S. economy or the U.S. currency." But it's much easier when a group of countries come together and becomes multilateral, and so there's an effort now, or there are discussions, very much like my Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group that I'm a part of, about the European Union, for instance, and the U.S. and Canada and other countries coming together as a consortium that say, hey, there are hundreds of billions of dollars of frozen Russian assets in Western governments. And so a multilateral effort where a bunch of countries come together versus just one, like the U.S., to enforce some sort of reparations or have a cap on the price of Russian oil or a set aside, like you mentioned, some percentage of a barrel of oil or a dollar of revenue that goes into a fund to reconstruct Ukraine. I think those are all sort of viable discussions, viable topics.
We've got time for one more question from the audience, and then we'll.
I actually have two questions. And first, if you follow your brother's tweets, you'll see that I had a quick interaction with him this morning. I said I'd say hi to you when I saw you today.
Okay.
My first one goes back to the United Nations. Given Russia's actions over the last 10 to 12 months, and this might be naive on my part, how is it they're still allowed to participate in the United Nations? I guess why do they still have that seat at the table, even if it is a temporary absence because of this war? And my second question is, you were talking about your working group on the war crimes. In your opinion, to the gentleman's question to my left here, what do you see as a timeline for any accountability in the war crimes area? Are we talking years, decades, what?
Sure. So first question is, the Russians are still on the Security Council, and they veto anything that attempts to hold them accountable. There is really no workable mechanism to kick them off. There were some thoughts about using the General Assembly, a vote in the General Assembly, and there have been a couple actually that have been very, very lopsided, where like 140 countries supported Ukraine in resolutions, 5, North Korea, Iran, I think even China abstained. 5 countries supported Russia and a bunch of abstentions. But it's not really viable, I think, right now to do, they have 7,000 nuclear weapons. They have a vastly diminished but still a large conventional force. And they are, they're on the Security Council, so there's just not a very good mechanism. Now, I think there's potential for that to change if, for instance, the Russians end up losing this war, like I think they will. I don't know exactly how this would play out, and I can probably come up with some scenarios, but I don't see Putin as a strongman surviving after he demonstrates he's not very strong. And so if that happens, if that occurs and there starts to be a fracture, regional fractures in Russia, then I could see reconsideration of whether they remain on the Security Council, becoming more like pragmatically a viable question. As far as accountability, I think the Ukrainians have actually already had a couple of war crimes trials. They've been criticized because some have complained that they have not met international standards, and that's part of the reason for this international mission that I'm part of. But there's kind of there has to be a web of accountability. So, the Ukrainians are likely to prosecute soldiers, the soldiers that violate the law of war on the ground. They've done that with POWs that have been captured. For instance, they've had one of the cases involved a soldier shooting basically a civilian vehicle and killing the people inside of it. So that will happen probably up to some level of leadership, of Russian military leadership. I think the International Criminal Court is going to have a role to play, and they'll probably prosecute the senior-most members of the Putin regime at some point if a prosecution like that comes through. And then there could be other international bodies. There's a discussion about whether there should be an additional international tribunal to try the crime of aggression. So, without getting into a lot of legalistic issues, that's the question about whether the war was started justly. And then countries like Germany and others that have universal jurisdiction, as I mentioned earlier, may try some cases. For instance, if somebody years from now comes into Germany and they're determined to have been, indicted, or there's evidence against them, they could be tried by a German court. So I think on the lower end, you're going to have continued trials. The regime, the senior leaders of the regime, may be years off. And now, if Russians lose the war next year and Putin is toppled, then he could be tried very easily next year. But it's possible that that part of accountability may be years off. And in the U.S. and in Germany, they've been, and in Yugoslavia, they've been trying war crimes trials for decades. So
one final question. So I've been teaching American government for many years, and one of the tensions with it, of course, is you want to try to give students hope, you want to try to give some belief in this whole democratic system, and then sometimes you read the newspaper and it's just hard to find where that hope is, and that, optimism and pessimism against each other. Now, I'm sitting here tonight and spending some time with someone who's not only an observer of the story, but also part of the story, and very much a player in one of the key pieces of American history in our lifetime. And so I guess the last question I want to ask you is, when you think back to your story and your experiences, as you kind of reflect and think about it, is it an optimistic story of the system working, or is it a pessimistic story of things being broken?
So I would say it's a mixed bag.
Thought you might.
Yeah. I'm very hopeful, actually. Very hopeful, certainly after this last round of elections, because I think the American people have recently decided that they've had enough of extremism, and that they've chastened the most far-right elements in the Republican Party, and 2024 probably does not look so good for Republicans if they were not able to take advantage in Congress of a very, very unpopular president. So I'm much more optimistic now than I was in late October. And I think on the whole, the American people, we're pretty smart. We made a mistake, maybe a couple mistakes, but I think it was Churchill that said, the American people will do the right thing after I'm screwing this up, but they've done everything else wrong, or something like that.
I think Churchill also is the one who, at least is widely credited with saying democracy is the best form of government, or is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Yeah.
So, Bob, you want to close the evening? Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you, Colonel Vindman, for this wonderfully stimulating conversation. Thank you for everyone who's come out, and thank you to everyone who's zoomed in to this meeting. For those of you who are here, we have refreshments, so stay, have some snacks, chat, and it's out in the back by the piano lounge out there. All right, thank you.